Since I've been around 10 years old, my favorite movie has been The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. I think it's funny The Shining is my favorite movie because I've never really been a fan of horror movies and I actively try to stay away from them. The Shining has always scared me for reasons not inherently superficial. There's something so haunting about the film that feels like it almost radiates off the disc. Something so creepy and eerie that one cannot help but be intrigued by how such a film was made. The film doesn't advantage itself through jump scares or visceral gore, but instead threatens the audience. There's a sinister feeling that comes along with viewing the film. I want to dive into this, with interest in what makes movies in general creepy, and how Stanley Kubrick created the creepiest film of all time. Without further ado, this video essay will discuss the underlying themes and specifically the myths that lie deep in The Shining, and why Stanley Kubrick put them there. I think a big influence in determining what makes a film creepy, to begin at a pretty basic level, is the director's sentiment towards the horror genre. Stanley Kubrick took his stab at horror, and we can deduct from much of what he says that his view on horror tends towards the psychological. In an interview, Stanley Kubrick explained his reasoning for making The Shining. He said, "Realism is probably the best way to dramatize argument and ideas. Fantasy may deal best with themes that lie primarily in the unconscious. I think the unconscious appeal of a ghost story, for instance, lies in its promise of immortality. If you can be frightened by a ghost story, then you must accept the possibility that supernatural beings exist. If they do, then there is more than just oblivion waiting beyond the grave. I believe fantasy stories, at their best, serve the same function for us that fairy tales and mythology formerly did." There's clearly something very emotionally laden here. Kubrick intended for his film to operate on an unconscious level, and this is the level that fear works best. Kubrick determined that the best way to get particular themes across would be to use the genre of horror and terror anxiety. And Kubrick evidently believes that these fantasy stories can replace realism to understand these themes. In Andre Bazin's Discourse on Cinema and Theater, he explains that quote pretty well. "There is nothing to prevent us from identifying ourselves in imagination with the moving world before us, which becomes the world. In the end, the viewer will connect with what's on the screen, and the viewer interpretation of horror becomes increasingly more palpable." But The Shining isn't a traditional horror in the general sense, as all of the normal horror devices occur in the psyche. This is where the creepiness creeps in. Creepiness relies on a feeling of unease that's generated through the threat of danger. But this is just a film, so it can't actually put you in any danger, could it? Instead, The Shining operates on a level of uncanniness through a facade. The Shining is veiled by myth that acts as let's say, a mask. Masks are creepy because they limit initial social interaction and instill a sense of unsureness in its audience. Myths are creepy because they dance at the edge of truth, and it becomes troubling not knowing whether to accept them as truth or not. There are many examples of The Shining's inherent mythos, but I want to focus on one particular myth and its functions in the unconscious, the Greek myth of the Minotaur. For those that don't know this mythology, which I hope would be few, I can describe it using The Shining to knock out two birds with one stone. In the scenario, the father, Jack Torrance, plays the role of the Minotaur, half man, half beast, a creature that survives through child sacrifices and dwells inside the labyrinth of Minos on Crete. One of the best ways to generate a sense of ambiguity, as Freud suggests in his essay on the uncanny, is to leave characters in a state of limbo, so the viewer or reader does not focus entirely on the uncertainty. In the film, the viewer is unsure if Jack is really man or beast, and the implications of each. Danny plays the role of Theseus, a hero that takes the place of one of the children in order to defeat the Minotaur. Before he enters the labyrinth, a woman named Ariadne, who is Wendy, falls in love with him and gives him a ball of string so he would be able to navigate the maze. Theseus enters the maze and kills the Minotaur, navigates his way out, and escapes with Ariadne away. The archetype makes sense. However, Kubrick wrote the archetypes to be more representative of a sort of Oedipus complex. But why? This is where Kubrick connects the film with myth and psychology. Perhaps the most interesting fact is the sexual connotation that goes along with this myth. In the myth, the Minotaur is the product of bestiality, and its association with child sacrifice bears perilous tones. In much other mythology of the time, the bull is associated with fertility, blood, and aggression. Especially in Mithraic mythology, The bull image, their main iconography, is accompanied by sacrificial bull slaying scenes, with the hero being nude. In The Shining, it is assumed through dialogue that Jack Torrance has physically abused his son in the past. What the myth is trying to present is the mere indication that Jack has not only physically abused Danny, but sexually abused him as well. Because Jack is this creature, we fear for Danny's safety both on a superficial level and subconscious level. Let's look at some examples from the film that represent the character's subliminal connection to the myth. This is the only scene in the movie where blood is not associated with death, but rather with Danny screaming. The scene immediately after this sees Danny laying on a creature, a bear in particular of sorts. Examine how similar the bear's face is to the elevator. But why a bear and not a bull? Well, if we watch this scene, which depicts Wendy running up the stairs, we see Wendy run up on a scene of a person in a bear costume performing fellatio. The character is supposed to look half man, half beast, a creature of uncertainty. The hybrid is dressed up in an infantile costume, with the pants unbuttoned at the bottom. The last connection we need is that of Jack and Danny. We'll take a look at the scene right before Wendy runs up the stairs. Jack chases Danny, presumably on his way to abuse the bull. In a few short scenes, we were able to see it all: the blood, the violence, and the beast. And the myth does fulfill itself. Danny's able to escape the labyrinth away from his father and reach Wendy. He leaves his father to die, goes and kisses his mother, and gets away safely. It's rather the only hope the viewer has for the movie. But we can't look over the rest of the movie. The anxieties we feel throughout are real. We worry for Danny's safety, both physically and mentally, because, on a deep level, we as viewers worry too that it's going to happen to us. It's so real because it's visible on the screen. Whether consciously or subconsciously, it's there. Kubrick's fantasy world becomes our world for a moment. If you can be scared by it, then you must accept that the fantasy might not be a fantasy after all.
Here's Johnny!